Sean and I are presenting tonight. I am the lead community involvement coordinator, and Sean Sheldrake is the lead EPA remedial project manager for the Portland Harbor Superfund Site. We just want to begin with a brief site background, and Sean will be leading that. And then we are going to go into why is there a proposed explanation of significant differences, what does that mean, what is an ESD, which is what we use as an acronym for short, and then we're going to go into what does this change mean for the Portland Harbor Superfund Site itself. And then we are going to do a question and answer session. So again, please submit questions in the Q&A pod, or we've called it the technical problems or questions pod, which is at the bottom of the screen. And then we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. We're hoping the presentation will last roughly 20 to 25 minutes. And I just want to clarify two things. One, that EPA will be providing this PowerPoint online and making it available to everyone after this presentation. My goal is for next week. And I also want to clarify that EPA is not collecting public comments on the proposed explanation of significant differences tonight. This session is to offer an opportunity to clarify information on the proposed ESD and to collect, to provide a question and answer session for everyone too. And so I'll be going over how you can provide public comments at the end of the session. All right, so that being said, we're going to move over to Sean, so I'm going to stop sharing my video, and Sean will start to share his, and we will continue the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Sean Sheldrake. Thanks for that introduction, Laura. We're going to start with some site background. This may be old news to many of you, but just so we're all starting in the same place. So the record of decision applies to a 10-mile stretch of the Lower Willamette River, about River Mile 2, just below the Multnomah Channel, and up to River Mile 12 between Broadway and Fremont Bridges. And the area that was originally listed is pictured here, which goes all the way up to the falls, which was studied starting from the listing in 2000. And one of the key pieces that's important to mention here is all the important work that the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality has been doing, both in the upland areas where the ROD applies to, in that lower 10 miles of the river, in doing source control work, as well as upriver in the downtown reach, basically from the Broadway Bridge up to the Selwood Bridge area and beyond. And that source control work is key in order to be able to complete an effective cleanup in that lower 10-mile stretch. And for the monitored natural recovery that is going to take place after the active cleanup is concluded, that upstream work that DEQ has been working on will hopefully allow us to achieve lower levels for contaminants like PCBs. Next slide. There it is. Okay. So we're focusing on 4 key chemicals or groups of chemicals that help guide where we're going to be doing active cleanup for the record of decision. And just as a reminder, those include PCBs, PHs, the whole DDX family, as well as dioxins and furans. And we're going to be spending time, of course, talking more in detail about PHs and specifically about carcinogenic PHs this evening. Next slide. Okay, so why are we looking at this proposed ESD, or explanation of significant differences? So in the process of putting the rod out in early January of 2017, immediately after that occurred basically a 15-year process of reviewing the carcinogenic pH data that had been compiled to date was concluded by our IRIS program, and that occurred a few days after the ROD was published. And the process that we follow as far as the site-specific decisions for a particular site, after a ROD is published, typically in our guidance, we would look at different updates to risk after the cleanup is concluded in our 5-year review process. And in this case, we were asked to look at it before we started active cleanup and to see if it might change the active cleanup footprint of where we're going to be doing, say, capping or dredging. And due to the high level of public interest in the record of decision, EPA decided to put this out for public comment as we would for a ROD, even though this is a smaller and not fundamental change. So why did the risk change for benzo a pyrene, that carcinogenic pH? It's something that IRIS does from time to time, look at particular chemicals and update the level of risk they pose, and that can revise the level of risk upward or downward. In this case, they spent over 10 years on the topic, and they found that the body of evidence was showing that this carcinogenic pH was less toxic than initially thought back in the 80s when the value was first published. And it's about 7 times less toxic, they decided, after that extensive peer review. So who was involved in that process? ATSDR, various other parts of the federal government were involved in extensive peer review, and this is just a highlight of some of the parties involved in that peer review that, again, took many years and involved quite a large amount of studies that they looked at, and they found it pointed in the direction of BAP posing, benzoate posing less risk. So we looked at how this change affects us at the Portland Harbor site specifically, and because we have 4 primary chemicals or families of chemicals that we're looking at, how pHs might be affected, certainly was interrelated with other chemicals at the site. And there are 24 chemicals that we're concerned about in sediments. That those 4 focused contaminants of concern help point us towards cleaning up the most contaminated areas, since those 4 focused COCs are present wherever we have any of the other 24 in levels that pose risk. So just to go back over what are our cleanup levels, our principal threat waste levels, and remedial action levels, what do those mean? Well, cleanup levels are where we're getting to acceptable risk, and in some cases we get to an acceptable risk level at the end of construction. In some cases we're waiting for monitored natural recovery to do its job on the majority of the site to get to cleanup levels. Principal threat waste is source material that's significantly elevated in concentration and has to be managed, especially due to its high toxicity or amenability to treatment, perhaps, or especially high-level material might call for more aggressive dredging or capping approaches. Our remedial action levels basically tell us where the active cleanup is going to be taking place, and we have different RALs, as you may recall, for the navigation channel than we do for the nearshore areas where a lot of the contaminants were originally released. So just a quick review of our remedial action objectives, and we wanted to highlight the RAOs that were particularly affected by this change or this evaluation and how it applies site-specifically to Portland Harbor. So RAO1, direct contact, human health, direct contact with sediment was particularly impacted by this update because the IRIS update, of course, is human health related for a carcinogenic chemical. Also, the uptake of, the consumption of clams, which is the second objective from the ROD, were primary RAOs that were evaluated in this proposed change. So just to go over, stepping back a little bit, the scope of this proposed change, just to put it in perspective. The majority of this cleanup is basically going to be slated for monitored natural recovery. So active cleanup is in a smaller percentage of the site to begin with. But, how many acres was it in the ROD? It was about 364 acres that were impacted by active cleanup, estimated to be slated for active cleanup. And this proposed change would decrease that number of acres by about 17. And that equates to about $35 million of change or reduction. So by the numbers, all the different aspects of the record of decision that were looked at and that were changed are listed here, and might take a little more time to go over this just because it helps to break down what analysis EPA and its partners did over the past year in looking at how this change might impact what we're undertaking in our active cleanup as well as our cleanup levels themselves. So on the first line, the direct contact CPH level was listed as 12 parts per billion CPH in the record of decision in Table 17, and this 7.3 times reduction in toxicity equates in a linear fashion to increase that acceptable level to 85 parts per billion in this proposal. So that would be for recreational beach. And if you remember, the Human Health Risk Assessment talked about recreational beaches being areas where people spend have about 90 days of exposure, so summertime exposure. And that is a level in this proposal that would be applied and for current recreational beaches as well as those that might become recreational beaches in the future. The next item on the list here is the direct contact for people that is based on the tribal fishing scenario, which is for nearshore sediment, and that level was 106 part per billion CPHs. That you can find in the feasibility study in terms of the rolling river miles that were evaluated for the tribal fishing scenario. And this update is a basically 7 times multiplier, so that proposed cleanup level would change to 774, which would apply to those nearshore areas where typically net fishing would take place. Clam consumption, that value was revised or proposed for revision in the ESD from approximately 7 parts per billion to 51, and that's a target level that would be an acceptable exposure for people to eat, and that concentration that would be acceptable to eat, it gets increased in this proposal. Now we also have a cleanup level that applies to sediments that helps get us to that target tissue level. That was 3,950 parts per billion in the ROD. In making this proposal and evaluating these changes, we did find that there was an error in that value in the ROD, and so we published an errata some months ago indicating that actually, due to a unit error, should have been 39.5 parts per billion. And so in conducting the update, the proposed update to the corrected value, that goes to 1,076 parts per billion. And so that is the expected level in sediment that would get us to the 51.6 right above that in clam tissue concentrations that would be acceptable to consume. A level that didn't change because it's not a human health aspect is the benthic risk pH value, which is 23,000 parts per billion based on a literature value, and that level does not change for this proposal. There's no new information there in terms of the ecological risk, so we're not proposing a change to that. And the PTW, the principal threat waste threshold, is a 1,000 times multiplier on the direct contact tribal fisher scenario above, so that's just adding 3 zeros onto that number, so those are our highly toxic values. The nearshore pH RAL, which is a total value, in the feasibility study was calculated. It essentially was loosely associated with an acceptable risk after construction on that tribal fishing scenario. Not exactly, but fairly closely. And so with this change, one of the things that they're pointed out to EPA was that isn't 13,000 parts per billion total pH is more active cleanup than necessary to get to the original objectives that went into the feasibility study, proposed plan, and ROD. And so in looking at that issue, we found that we could get to an acceptable risk after construction with a less aggressive remedial action level of 30,000 parts per billion total pHs. Will get us to acceptable direct contact risk immediately after construction. So that's part of the proposed ESD. There's no proposed change for the navigation channel remedial action levels for a few reasons. The different remedial action objectives we pictured earlier, there are concerns about levels of pHs in surface water that are above acceptable levels for human health and ecological receptors, that as well as benthic exposures that led us to propose no change to that remedial action level. So looking pictorially at what this means for this site, we're going to have Laura zoom in on a few areas here because this is pretty hard to see. The red is, or orangish red is basically the proposed change. And we might need to move it downstream a little bit there.
Should we start here?
Yeah, there we go. So looking at Terminal 4, you can see a slight change around the edges of that, and you can see that there aren't changes proposed for much of the site aside from Port of Portland's T4 and a bit of the Gasco Siltronic area as we move the map upstream. It's simply because much of the site, as I mentioned, is conflagration of those 24 chemicals posing risk, and there are overlapping focused COCs at much of our sediment management areas where active cleanup is required. The exceptions are around the Gasco and T4 where PAHs are more dominating. This sort of change is highlighted because they're without any changes to the other remedial action levels. This is really only affecting areas with PAHs as a primary driver.
Just going to scroll through the rest of the site on the map so you can see.
Thank you. So pretty focused on those two areas, as you can see.
So coming back to me, and I will start my webcam again because we're almost done. So just the last bit here, how can I be involved? So there are several different ways, mainly providing written comments to EPA on the proposed explanation of significant differences is one of the main ways. And we are taking comments until Friday, December 21st, which is a 60-day total public comment period. We initially went out with 30 days and received a request for an extension, so granted 30 more. So due to high public interest, like Sean said, that's why we're doing written comments and issued the proposed explanation of significant differences for public comment. So until Friday, December 21st, there are two ways that you can send us written comments. You can send us comments via email to harborcomments@epa.gov. You can also mail us comments, and the address is on this slide here. It's also on our website, which you can see is also on the next bullet. So those are ways that you can provide us with feedback directly on the proposed explanation of significant differences. And just one comment is that we are only taking comments on the proposed explanation of significant differences. If we get comments that are outside the scope of what Sean just went over, we will not be responding to. Also, you can review the webinar recording from this evening of this portion of the presentation on our website. So we are going to be posting this recording on our website, which is listed right here. You can also attend an in-person proposed explanation of significant differences community information session, which will be on Tuesday, November 20th from 6 to 8:30 p.m. And it will be at the Eco Trust building, and the address is on the slide. You can also, we're going to have our third actually public forum on December 12th. We're doing our best to hold these public forums quarterly with support from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and the Portland Harbor Community Advisory Group. And so at that forum, we are planning to have at least a portion of that forum talk about the proposed explanation of significant differences and probably go over these slides again to provide an additional chance for questions and answers. So that is how you can be involved. And for more questions after this webinar too, we have Sean's contact information and my contact information. So that concludes our main presentation for this evening.